Good evening. Yeah? I'd like to call the meeting to order. Clerk, can we have the roll call, please?
Mayor Brummel? Here. Alderman Ashar?
Here.
Alderman Berry?
Here.
Alderman Bevier?
Here.
Alderman Davalos? Here. Alderman Goodman?
Here.
Alderman Krischel?
Here.
Alderman Widener?
Here.
Alderman Wilson?
Alderman Wilson is excused.
Thank you.
All right. Will those who are able join me for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now's the time that we set aside for citizens' comments. I don't have anyone who has signed up to speak tonight, but we can take citizens' comments on the business of the meeting. Next, we'll go to officials and staff comments. Mayor, do you have any?
I have nothing this evening, thank you.
Any other officials and staff? Administrator Coakley.
Just to introduce, Dawn Gravetti is our interim executive assistant. She's filling in the vacancy in our department. She'll be taking the minutes tonight as well as at the budget workshop coming up in March. So I realized everybody hasn't met her, so she'll be, the agreement that you just approved last Monday night, or Tuesday night, is for Dawn services through May 1st. So that's who's taking the minutes tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's nothing further, we'll move on to the business of the meeting. We'll begin with item 1, a discussion of the lower than projected general fund balance reserves. And we will start with Administrator Coakley. You're going to step down to the lectern. There's information on the dais with some balance sheets and a memo in your backup material with some summary information.
Okay. I don't usually stand on this side, so hopefully everybody can hear me. First, thank you, Mayor Alderman, for coming to a special meeting tonight. This was supposed to be a night off, but I appreciate the time that you've all committed. I know most of us have Monday nights blocked off on our calendar for the rest of time, but you probably knew this was supposed to be a night off, and it's a good thing you're here because there's an important topic to talk about. As you probably remember, this coming Friday, the 29th or 28th of February, 28th is Friday, you will be getting the fiscal year 21 proposed budget booklet. The reason I asked to have a meeting for tonight is to talk about some things you'll see in that book and to focus your attention on some important issues so that you're aware of them. And not to get too far ahead of myself, but there's a lot of meetings between now and the time you have to adopt the budget in April. We will have discussions of these matters on every meeting going forward, whether a council meeting or a committee of the whole meeting. Excuse me. Okay. I guess forgot to. Oh, there we go. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. So, the things that we're going to talk about tonight, and then we'll be here for whatever questions you have. The whole staff is here if there's questions about other things with the budget. But we realize you don't have the budget booklet, you don't have the details. Again, the point of the meeting is to make sure that you have a highlight and focus about some things you're going to see in the budget, in the general fund especially, but it's all interrelated, as you'll see. We're going to talk about the general fund balance reserves, a projected general fund deficit, staff recommendations, how to deal with the first two items, and then just talk about the budget schedule a little bit more so you're comfortable with how we're going to lay out the discussions of this going forward before the budget has to be adopted. So what's the issue? Why are we even here? Fiscal year 21 projections show the reserves, let's see, that's below the 25% threshold. As you remember, the council has established a threshold for contingency purposes if we have emergencies to keep the general fund balance at least 25%. What we're going to show you is our projections show that at the end of next year, it will be below that amount. Which means for fiscal 21 and probably 22, we will have leaner years than we've had. It doesn't mean we can't operate or that we're not going to be open. It means that some of the new spending that was hoped for will have to be delayed a few years. Unfortunately, because of the state laws, we do year-to-year budgets. If we could do a 5-year budget or even a 3-year budget, the picture would be a lot rosier. It's not terrible, but it would be better if you look long-term. We'll talk about that in just a minute, too. Okay, this is the main issue we wanted to talk about. The threshold that we're supposed to maintain the general fund at is 25%. That's of the annual general fund expenses, so it varies year to year by a bit. Fiscal year 20, which we're in right now, the end of the fiscal year, the budgeted projection a year ago that we passed out the budget booklet showed the fiscal year would end with 37% fund balance reserves, or 7% fund balance total. What we are projecting now for the budget that you're about to get, this is the main point of the meeting, and all the explanation about it, is that next year's fund balance will be at 6%. That's a big difference. Kevin, go to the, sorry. Who knows? So how did we get here? And this is the main point, that we've discussed the issue. That's the simple fact, is optically there's a big difference there. The rest is a lot more complicated, takes more explanation and detail. And again, we're just starting this discussion in our view tonight. Our staff does not see this as the end of it and we're gonna walk away. We'll keep working through this with you and talking about it for all the meetings going forward until the budget needs to be adopted. And I think you'll have a good understanding of it long before then. Where did the revenues go from the reserves? Well, over a number of years, as you know, the city has invested in TIF 3 and TIF 4 through interfund loans. Whether it was buying land in the different TIFs or whether it was investing in a redevelopment agreement such as Lexington Trace, the city has committed a lot of money for future redevelopment. The city has also committed, I think wisely, and the council obviously agreed, to do extra pension fund contributions each year. $250,000 for, I never get this number right, at least the last I think it's
We've been doing that since, on average, since 2012. Now, it hasn't been 250,000 every year. By the time we're done with fiscal 20, we'll be over $2 million that we've put in extra into the fund.
which, again, the council made that decision with forethought of it's a big investment to reduce our future liabilities, but we used fund balance for that as well. Road work, such as engineering and some other things before roads are constructed, and we used a large sum of that money for Warrenville Road. Not all of it came from fund balance, but around $200,000. And the ERP project, which is still ongoing, is a very large cost, and it was a large one-time project. The council approved fund balance to use for that. One thing I want to back up and say here is, I didn't mention it right up front, is we're going to talk to you about how the money has been accounted for, how the money has been spent with the council approval. But the money is all still here. It's not a case of where you have some other towns where there's a big drop there and something happened to the money. The money is here, it's being accounted for differently. We're going to talk a lot about that in a minute. But the money has not been, well, if we were east of here, it may have been taken, it may have been misappropriated. That's not the case in any way. It's just an accounting change in how we're looking at the money, which changed the fund balance. And that's the next point, is accounting change. Go back one second, not quite yet. We have, in the last fiscal year, there was an approval to change how we look at the fund balance and identify, and Kevin's going to get the accounting part. I'm going to not try to get into that because I'm not an accountant. Identifying the fund balance that is non-spendable, the part that is applied to cover those loans to the TIFs. And Kevin's going to walk you through that in just a second. It had been shown as spendable fund balance. We made that change at the very end of the fiscal year, but when the audit was done, so it was middle of this fiscal year. So in the fall, that accounting change was done. We discovered this impact of it as we're putting together the revenues and expense projections for this year. Based on that, the aforementioned projects, you've all heard about how much time this is taking. I won't bore you with those projects of our time this year. We were very late in our normal process, Kevin and I, in staff input, in getting the revenue projections for this coming year's budget. So instead of having those in late December or early January, we had those at the very beginning of February. Hence, we just discovered this situation in the last 2.5 weeks. So this is really, by the time we could look at it, analyze it, figure out everything that's going on so we can explain it without having a lot of detailed actuarial and accounting information, we are here tonight with this meeting. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, who will walk through the accounting changes so you can better understand those, and then I'll come back up and walk through things, and then we'll get to questions and comments and any information you may need after that.
Do it. Close it. Then I should be able to go back to here. Okay, so I'd like to start you out with the most recent one you've seen, which will help us get back to a prior time where it didn't quite look like this. When we showed you the FY19 annual audit report, that was the first time that we had shown the interfund loans to the TIFs as non-spendable. Here at the bottom, we have $4.516 million of non-spendable fund balance. That's where we showed you in a clearer way the interfund loans that have gone from the general fund to the TIFs. When you look back in prior to that, go back to fiscal 18. Now this would be the first sheet in the handout of 3 that you have. There are 3 of them that are attached. At the end of fiscal 2018, we had an unassigned, or we showed an unassigned fund balance of $9,343,000. If you look up at the top there, there's also the due from the other funds, which is $3.7 million. The majority of that was the interfunds that went from the general fund to the TIFs. We're working with the auditors is how we got to the fiscal 19 the display where we changed how that was shown and showed you the non-spendable. There are 2 reasons for that. One is there were a number of questions that we wanted to make sure we weren't spending money twice. And people wanted to see clearer that we are accounting for those interfund loans and that they could actually see those. The other side of that equation is, having spoken to the auditors, they as a firm know the scrutiny that TIFs are under, and they as a firm made a decision that they wanted to help municipalities better show the relationship between TIFs and any loans and things that went on between the TIFs and the general fund. That's how we got to where we are. So what I wanted to do was go back and show you what the fiscal 18 would have looked like had we had that in place at that point, and the picture would have looked different. The bottom line wouldn't have been different, but the picture would have been different. If you look here, I've restated the fiscal 18 to show now that instead of having 9.3 million in unassigned fund balance, only 5.6 of that is actually unassigned. The non-spendable now would have shown 3.7 million, again, which is the interfund loans from the TIFs. So what we've done here is provide a clearer picture of where the money is, which bucket it is in, what's spendable and what is non-spendable. That was the goal, to clear all that up so that everybody understood where that money was and how it was being accounted for. Hold on, got to get back to the, yep, trying to get them up here, that's all. Okay, so the point the administrator made here at the beginning is when we work through the initial budget, we will end fiscal 2020 with a 27% balance. As we worked through fiscal 21, we ended up at a 6%. That's taken into consideration the accounting change and the estimates of where the interfund loans will be at the end of the year, which by that point, we estimate will be at $5.3 million to the two TIFs. So obviously, the 6% is well below the 25% that we are supposed to be at, and that's why we're here tonight, to talk through that issue with you. Want to go to the next year, or do you want to go to the staff recommendation discussion? Okay. Show them which year? No, not for, no. We don't have the 22s yet. The 22 and beyond are not there. Those are still being finalized. Oh, I can go through the other one, yes. The other one's with the recommended changes. Okay. So after we saw the initial picture, staff worked to on some ideas here that will help shore this up and allow some more time to work forward. There are 4 proposals that will be for your consideration. One would be to suspend the additional contributions into the police pension fund for both 20 and 21. I don't actually myself see an issue with that, as the consolidation of the pension fund is on the horizon here anyway. How that is all going to be finalized in the state has not yet been worked out. I don't know what the mechanisms will be for even getting additional money in going forward. But now is a good time that if we hold up on those, we can wait and see how that conversion works and see if there's still even the opportunity to do those, and then how that mechanism would work going forward. The other thing we've proposed in there would be that in fiscal 2021, we return to doing transfers from the Hotel Motel Fund, which would be a $200,000 transfer. If you will recall, we used to do that very regularly. The last time we did that was in the end of fiscal 2016, when we were far more flush and had far more unassigned fund balances. The final thing we did that are recommending here that adds the most to this is to take the assigned fund balance, and it's moved so you can't see it here, but that figure would be $2.9 million. The assigned fund balance was the money remaining from when we closed the special projects fund. What we've been doing the last 2 years or so is allocating some of the one-time projects in the general fund. The majority of those were road-related or public works related against that, so it wasn't coming out of our normal unassigned fund balance. It allowed us to do as we did when the special projects fund was open and account for those one-time things and sort of use that money up as we go. So we've recommended that we reassign that into the unassigned. All assigned fund balance means is that that's what we've opted to do with the money. It's done by our intention to use it. Our intention on assigned fund balance was to use it for one-time projects. If we reassign it to unassigned, that's absolutely fine, because then we're making a conscious decision to use that for other purposes at this point. When you incorporate all that in, we would end fiscal 2020 with a 29% fund balance, and the end of 2021 would be at 32%. So if you incorporate all those things, it'll allow us a little more time to get through the things we're waiting on to develop from all the investment we've made.
Okay, you want to go back to the slides then, and we can come back to these anytime when you have questions. We'll kind of walk through the rest and then get back to it. We got to move on. 4 slides too far. We obviously didn't rehearse this.
Shouldn't be. That's where we
That's
left.
where you just went through. Okay, go to
Yep.
the next one, please. Okay. What we'll be recommending is the two-pronged goals, and then there's some specific steps below those that Kevin was just going over some of them. One is, in my opinion, the most important is to replenish the general fund reserves, because we don't know what's going to happen. A large retailer closes, the state does something else with or to us, et cetera. And that money we rely on to deal with any kind of such emergencies. We have 3 months of expenditures in the bank with the 25%, and therefore we can adjust and adapt, as we've talked about in the past during the recession, et cetera, how we would address those issues. And we can stretch out our existing revenues, the ongoing revenues with the contingency money, et cetera, should a large revenue problem happen. The second is to make long-term changes. There's long and short-term recommendations. Review budget and financial policies. We have established those over the years. Look back at some of them. We're just beginning to do this. We're, as I've said, 2.5 weeks into discovering there's a bigger issue that we need to address. So we look at the long-term policies, make adjustments with council's approval as we go along. We'll discuss all of this, of course, with the council as we're going forward. And we need to improve our revenue expense forecasting. We have done a pretty good job for many, many years. When there's plenty of money, that works out really well. We need to sharpen that up now because we have to be a lot more, we have to have a sharper pencil and more specific and accurate projections for the future. Thank you. Our short-term recommendations for the coming fiscal year, Kevin was just laying these out. We didn't have a slide up yet. Use the former special projects fund money. It's already in the general fund, but it has been set aside under the, what was the term?
Assigned fund balance.
Thank you. So the council could, and we'll present these, I'm going to back up for a second. These will be presented specifically next Monday at the city council meeting. At that point, you will already have the budget booklets in your hands, so we can walk through that and it'll make a little more sense. But again, the purpose tonight, from my view, is to give you a heads up about what's coming and walk through some of the things so you know that I didn't want you to open that book on Friday night or Saturday morning with your coffee and go, whoa, what the heck is going on here? The fund balance percentages have changed. So that's why we want to walk through where we're going now. But we're not asking for any decisions tonight. Final votes, we'll answer all the questions you have, or if you need more information, we can come back with that later. Leo is in the back taking notes on any questions or comments or things that we need to follow up on. So rest assured, we have a lot of meetings to work through any questions that you have. Okay, as Kevin was saying, there's almost $3 million that's already in the general fund. Take off the restriction of the,
Assigned fund balance.
thank you, and make it just a general purpose fund balance. It may be, if you wish, that we could have a repayment schedule over coming years as the revenues are increasing, that we could pay that back. Or it could be used as general fund revenues. That's up to a city council decision. As he said, reinstate the transfer in of $200,000 for the next couple of years at least. We'll talk about suspending the extra payments to the pension fund. As Kevin's mentioning, the state, as you may know, just approved a co-investing and a whole new management structure for each police and for fire pension funds. Our issue is police. That's going to have impacts. The rules aren't all set up right now, so there is even a question of whether we can pay advance right now or not. Again, this will be a council decision. The staff doesn't make this, but one would be suspending it from the end of this fiscal year before it's made, and the other would be not to make it in the next fiscal year, which is already a $500,000 difference. And then if the council wishes after the 2-year period to go ahead and continue prepaying that, they certainly could do that. And then engage financial consultant. I've already taken steps to do that, to bring somebody on board for the short term, to look at our budgeting, how we do it, and the revenue and expense forecasting. As a retired finance director that we have found through GovHR. Right now it's a smaller amount I can approve for my spending authority. I wanted to get started quickly. He will come in next week and start working with Kevin and I, look at how we do these things. I don't anticipate that will have a big impact on this current budget that we're preparing that you're going to see, but we can start working towards next year. Kevin and I have talked for years about how we'd like to be more precise with our revenue and expense projections. Maybe we can change a budget. But like everything else in life, as soon as you're done with that big task, you move on to all the other work and you get back to the next year and say the same things again. So we're taking the steps to get that going. additional short-term recommendations for '22, which is the next fiscal year. We're going to recommend that at this time, we continue the same actions that you recommend, assuming they're taken for '21, to continue that transfer and to continue the suspension of that extra payment. And at the same time, during '21, because '22 is a long way away. Right now, we can't predict what's going to happen all the way through fiscal '21. We're not even in that year yet. But during the coming fiscal year, at every single one of the Public Safety and Finance Committee meetings, there will be an update about the general fund and any other funds that are related to it. We're touching on, it affects how the TIFs are paying back the general fund. Sometimes the hotel tax fund will be involved. So we'll give you more specific updates and plan that discussion for each of those for your questions, and we'll have information to present on how we're doing. That will put us in a much better position at the start of the fiscal '22 budget preparation process to be planning ahead for what we may need to do. As I mentioned earlier, the next 2 years I call lean years because we can't do a lot of the new initiatives that we'd like to do unless we find additional revenue, but with the revenues and expenses we have. But the longer term prospects, if you think about what all those TIF investments have gone for, a year ago I couldn't tell you with a lot of certainty when we'd start getting payback, but the construction of Everton and Lexington Trace and the construction of the Earhart Stafford Place project in TIF 3, the other two are in TIF 4, those are the developments that are actually under construction. Now we know there's potential for other things like a Thornton's and a Culver's and a Warrenville Horizons, but they're not in the ground yet. They're coming, but they're not on the ground yet, so we're not planning on them at this point. Go to the next slide for the longer term recommendations. I've jumped out, I've gotten ahead of myself, but well, that's not in here. Well, I'll just keep talking about it. We'll get back to that slide. Ron Menser is working very hard with Kevin to put together the projected TIF 3 and TIF 4 payback schedule of all those interfund loans, because those now are a lot more tangible. The value of those properties have already gone up the moment they closed on them. They became private. They're commercial value. They're no longer agricultural property. You can drive by there and see all the improvements just in the TIF. Well, next door is nearly complete. I think there's 5 houses yet to be built. When they're occupied, the certificates of occupancy are issued. They get captured by the assessors in the respective, all Winfield Township next September, October when they close their books. The following June and September, we start getting the new revenue. And as they build out, we'll continue, the TIFs will increase that revenue to pay back those loans. There's $5-point-something million between the two TIFs where the money is loaned or owed to the general fund. As those monies come in, the general fund coffers will be refilled and it will with increasing speed over the next couple of years. So this is not, as I said before, if we could look at this in a 3 or 5 year projection or 3 or 5 year budget, we just have to smooth those things over. It's not a big deal. But we do year-to-year budgets. So when you look at year to year, the general fund reserves are significantly lower than 25%. That's something we need to pay attention to. All right, let me get back to our regular slide here. Long-term recommendations. That's what I was referring to, is the general fund repayment schedule from both TIFs. That we're working on. We don't have it yet. I will make a side note. If the ERP were already in place, we could pull that information up very quickly. Because we have all the old general fund ledgers, mostly paper, it takes a lot longer. So we will have that. It isn't available tonight. We will have it to you in front of you as soon as it's put together in the next few weeks. Recommending continuing the transfer of the hotel tax fund. Again, the pension payments, those are large sums that can, based on a council decision on how you want to handle those, but those could help go a long way to address some of those issues. And implement the consultant's recommendations. I anticipate we're going to work with them for not every day, but over a period of about 3 months now, the financial consultant on budgeting issues and revenue and expense forecasting. Get recommendations from them, consider them, talk to the council about them, and implement them. And one last item, the fund balance work group. You have assigned Alderman Wilson and Alderman Goodman to work with staff We had been working on that. Issues in the past was how to deal with the larger fund balances, whether we should close one fund and move it to another. This would be a good opportunity to get that group back together. In fact, I'm going to suggest that we broaden its scope to be a long-range financial planning work group and look at those things longer term, at least for the probably next 2 fiscal years. Maybe we meet every other month, maybe we meet monthly for a while and work through some issues. We got to work out schedules. I haven't even talked to them about this yet, but get their input and then we'll make recommendations on the bigger, broader policy issues to the council for consideration. Okay, just to reassure you that this isn't a one-off meeting where you've never seen me do that, but just talking to you about an issue and then walking away. I fully intend to have this discussion, especially about the recommendations to address the fund balance for fiscal '21 on the March 2nd agenda, which is next Monday. So under the regular agenda, we'll have a whole section, which is new for the meetings preceding the budget workshop, to talk about the fiscal year budget. But that will be a specific topic that Kevin and I will bring back for that meeting, along with anything that you would like to have, as long as we can get it together before Wednesday. If we can't get the information you should request, then we'll bring it back to one of the meetings coming up after that. We have a lot of meetings before the budget has to be adopted on April 20th. As you may remember, by law, the city, under the Budget Officer Act, has to adopt a budget before April 30th, the end of our fiscal year. But in addition to the budget workshop on Saturday, March 14th, we also have 2 city council meetings in March, 2 in April, and between the 2 months, 3 committee of the whole meetings, and we will work through this with whatever questions and issues that you have. I don't know that it'll take that long. It's a fairly straightforward issue, but the explanation of how we address it and how we got there is obviously a lot more complex. That's where it becomes less simple. And I think we're to questions. Anything that we can answer or address, and also if there's more information, please, that you need, let us know, and we'll try to get it back on the 2nd or whatever meeting immediately thereafter.
Okay, that's been a lot of information to digest all at once, but I know that there are going to be questions, and I know that people are going to want to hear more details about what's going on. Let's start with the treasurer.
Okay, let's start. I got 3 specific questions. First one is about the police pension. We're not going to put in $250 extra proposal, but are we still having some contributions that would normally go through the
We are required to make annual contributions. All we're talking about not making is the additional contributions over and above what we normally have to put into the fund, which is now around $1 million a year.
Second question was on the, I'm not familiar with, we're putting, our proposal is to put the hotel tax fund, $200,000 into the general fund. Where's it going now? Is it a separate fund and not being spent, is it gonna be spent differently?
The $200,000 we're referring to would be hotel tax fund balance. Right now, it just stays in that fund when it's not used. So it does not go anywhere else. It's just money that comes out of
Okay, so it's just,
fund balance in the fund.
it's an accounting, just the difference of accounting. If it doesn't, if it stays in that balance, then it'll move to the general fund.
No. So what happens is the hotel tax fund can be used by a home rule community as it sees fit. One of the things that can do here is to transfer that money to support another fund, which in this case is the general fund. Up until 2016, we did that annually. We stopped in 2016. We are recommending now that we return that. If we did not make that $200,000 transfer out of the hotel fund into the general fund, it would just stay as part of the hotel tax fund balance.
Okay, so it's the same amount of money still there then?
Correct.
Okay, that's it. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. Alderman Berry.
My question has to do with the, this consultant, engaging a financial consultant for budgeting review and expenditure projections. You said you've already gone ahead and done that?
Yes.
Okay, and how much does that cost? How long is the term for this person? You know, those kinds of questions, because, I mean, that, to me, that's kind of spending money that we maybe don't need to spend. We've taken other things off of our Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, but now we're making others expenditures for something that I don't know if it's necessary that we have to have. It seems to me that, you know, we have a nice long list here of items where we've spent the money over the years. We kind of know where the money has gone. And we know that in the next few years, it's projected for TIF 2 and TIF, or excuse me, TIF 3 and TIF 4 for monies to come back into the general fund. And we've seemed to do pretty well with that over the last, since we made our very first TIF in the early 1990s. So I'm not quite sure what this consultant is supposed to be doing.
Okay, the consultant is solely, at this point, to just look at how we do our budgeting, to work with us as we're finishing up or going through this budget process. They won't be here while we're preparing the budget document itself, but to catch, to observe and review documents on how we put together the budget, how we project revenues and expenses, because we do that in a very, I don't want to say overly simplistic way, but it's based on a trend analysis. As you may have noticed, revenues are trended as generally flat because we have a great deal of difficulty projecting them in the future. We don't have models that we use. We have been doing this historically for probably 20 years with the same way. Expenses are very easy to trend because the majority of the general fund, at least, is almost 70% is personnel costs. We know what those are going to be. Majority of our employees are under union contracts, so we know what their increases are going to be for several years going forward. And that always trends up on a slight degree because supplies don't get cheaper, wages never get cheaper. And so we can trend the expenses going up and the revenues stay flat, and it shows a mismatch. We stopped showing the 5-year projections because it always looked dire, even in years where we wouldn't spend as much, our expenses would be lower, the revenues would be higher. In the good years, that worked fine. What we're looking for is to make it sharper and be more precise so we can be better with our revenue projections, so we don't have some of the, at least optically at this point, because we haven't got into that process. We haven't started to work with them yet. Optically, it won't look like we're increasing and decreasing revenues and expenses are offset so much. We can project further out so we can plan better ahead. We can look at other ways to do budgeting. We've been following the same budgeting model, if you will, for at least 15 years. There's new ways to do that. We don't usually have the time to go out and find those. So this person will come in and do that. The total expense should not exceed $20,000. I don't even think we'll get to that,
Is that $20,000 a year?
just for this contract. It's about a 3-month period. We have engaged them, it's $100 an hour, and we would set the amount of hours that we have, but it will not exceed a certain amount. We need to get started with them and lay out how that work is going to go. Should we find that there seems to be a need to extend that, I'll come back to the council and ask you, because it would exceed my spending authority and I would need your permission to do that. But we'll have a clear plan at that point. With this, I just have concerns about some of this is based on the way we project, some of the cause of the change is based on the way that we're projecting revenues and expenses and looking at things going forward. And I think there's better ways to do that. But without someone coming in to help guide us with that, I don't foresee that we're going to be able to make that change.
So basically what you're saying is that we have one model that we've kind of used over the years.
Yes.
And you think that this other person would come in with different models that we would be able to look at and decide which one we might want to use for this year or next year.
Probably longer term. I don't know that we can really get enough information to have a change for fiscal '21, because you're going to have that in your hands, and by the time we get through some of this work, it'll be virtually time to adopt that. Perhaps there'll be some changes for this year, but I'm looking more for the future, beyond this year.
Okay.
Yes, Alderman Widener, I saw next.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation and the information. Can you remind me when we started doing the extra payments to the police pension fund?
The first one, well, not the first one, the farthest one back that I've looked at is 2012. It was not $250,000 every year, but that's what we've worked up to now. There were other years we did 150,000. There was one year we actually did 300,000. So there's been a number of years where we've done varying amounts, but we've done it every year since 2012.
And can you give me some kind of percentage as far as our goal, I think, was to fully fund the police pension because even though there was no requirement for us to do so, we were taking extra dollars, correct, and applying it to the police pension in order to gain a full pension accumulation?
Correct. We need to be 90% funded by 2040. That's what the goal of everything we've been doing is.
Okay. At the time we did that, though, there weren't many communities that started doing what the city of Warrenville started doing with making those extra payments, correct?
I believe that's correct. I don't know of any others that are doing that.
Okay.
And I just want to add to one thing Kevin said is, our goal is to be at a higher percent funded level, certainly. There's not a one-to-one match, as we've talked about through the years, but the philosophy was, and the council had agreed, is that the more we pay in advance, the less it's going to cost us long-term. So it's reducing our long-term costs and working towards a 90% funding level. The 100% is, I don't think that's going to happen that quickly. We haven't planned to get that far ahead, but it certainly is reducing our long-term liability costs by pre-funding it, and we've done a substantial job to date.
Can we classify and give a percentage as far as how far along we are with that? I know it's something that no other community or very few communities are doing. It was something that we didn't have to do, but because of the recommendation from staff and the city council's foresight into the matter, we wanted to raise that level so that we were taking care of the potential for those commissions.
There is certainly not an easy answer to that, except that we are in this 72% area. Most communities are nowhere near that. 50% in some, there are some even down in the teens that I've heard of. So we're way ahead of where most are. I'm not saying that there aren't others who do a similar thing. I'm not aware of any, but we're well ahead of the game.
So if we pause those payments, does that estimated 72% fall back to 40% or 50%, or does it remain at 72% in the
There is actually no
projection?
way to answer that because there are so many factors involved, and it involves all the investing of the funds, all the return on those investments, anything that happens in there, all the additional contributions made by employees. Now, when we move ahead and we get into this consolidated investing by the state, that in theory, one of the goals there is to improve the ability to seek higher returns on those investments, which can only help us.
So initially, we were picking up because we feared the state wasn't doing anything to accomplish any kind of effort towards bringing those funds into balance or whatever for the future. So we kind of picked up on it with some funds of our own, correct?
I think we addressed an issue that the state at the time really had no handle on and didn't know how they were going to do anything with. Only recently, as you're aware, they've gone with this consolidation thing. I think we were far ahead of where they were, and we've done a remarkable job to move that forward.
And now the state is beginning to address it and pick up on it. Is that correct?
They have made the first step, which is this consolidation, which all the local governments, Illinois Municipal League, DuPage Mayors and Managers, all the other COGs were asking them to do. We see it as a first step. There's a lot of other steps that could be done, including not increasing any of the benefits to the pensions, which, as you may recall, the city, the pension, the active members of the pension fund, the police officers, and have to pay in a certain amount. Whatever is deficient to meet our requirements to fund it has to be made up by the city, regardless of what percent that is. All the benefits and the entire, how the pension fund works is all under the General Assembly. So they have, historically, and even in this recent change, gave away a few more things that improve and enhance the benefits for our public safety employees, but it costs more money. So it's not, as Kevin was saying, there's a lot of reasons it's not a simple answer. We will, though, continue to recommend, and we would recommend the city council never stop, paying the actuarial required amounts, recommended amounts. The actuaries look at our pension funds every year, look at the age and number of people that we have, the pending retirements and all the different rules, and they'll make a recommendation each year, and that's what gets put in the budget, and that's what you've been approving as the baseline. Then you've been paying extra on top of that to pre-fund it, to bring down the long-term costs that we'll have to, because if you don't pay for it now, it's kind of like your mortgage. If you stop paying that for a while, you'd have a lot more expenses to pay later on.
So in a sense, you know, our change to not increase the amount of funding, but do the, I guess, the mandatory percentage or amount into that fund would be kind of adopting a wait-and-see attitude to see what the General Assembly is going to do. It may not push us backwards in our goal, and we certainly hope that the General Assembly is going to approach it, and there are some positive signs that they are.
Yes, that's true. I don't know what the actual percent would be, but it won't reduce the amount of money that we have funded the pension funds. It won't reduce our progress towards that ultimate goal over the long term. Whether it's 72%, 73 next year, or 71.8, I don't know. There's all these things in the equation. That's why actuaries are very few and far between, and most of us, at least I couldn't pass that test to do it. It's a very complicated formula, but we will keep on paying what we're required to, making progress towards that. And this step with investing all the pension funds together, 600 and some odd, will help to return much more money than we can earn on our own, which is what we invest.
So we're not shirking our responsibility, we're just reducing the amount of overage that we've put on that fund since, I think Kevin said 2012.
Yes, correct. And we're only recommending it be suspended for 2 years and then reconsidered. We were talking about that before this issue came up because of the pension consolidation. We just started that conversation because the rules aren't written as we were talking about. We don't have, they're just setting that whole program up and who's going to administer it, and we don't know how we would even make those extra payments yet. So it would probably have been a good idea regardless, but now it has a little bit more importance to it.
Okay, I have just a couple other questions. One is regarding the hotel and motel tax dollars that are made available to the Tourism and Arts Commission. Has there been any kind of discussion or forecasting about not eliminating that program, but reducing the amount? Or is that such a negligible amount that it won't make up any amount of money? Because, you know, we could certainly pull back on, you know, future events, not taking away from the existing events and the historical and the good causes that we're supporting through that that fund. But has there been any thought on maybe reducing that amount?
A couple of things. It will be easier to talk through these details when you have the budget booklet and,
Okay.
and we're having the meetings, and we can flip to all the pages and do that
Yeah.
until everybody's
Okay.
eyes are rolling back in their head for looking
I
at numbers.
just wondered if there's been any staff discussion regarding that.
Let me answer that. We have not, we are not recommending changes in the current things that the city is doing, including the grants or any of the operations, or even such things as filling existing vacancies and positions. We don't see the need to do that. These recommendations that we're making shore up, if you will, the contingency, the general fund reserve money, so that we have that money clearly available for emergencies. Actually, that money that is the, what was the term? Assigned thing? I'm getting it. I'm going to learn accounting by the end of this. Assigned fund balance is still there and was available. We just want to make it clearer so it optically shows as available contingency money. Also, as we were looking at the budget, there was a number of, and we'll share those with you during the budget discussions, decision packages that had new projects, ideas, personnel for the coming year, which are all good things, but they need to be paid for. So I have pulled those all out of the budget consideration, so not included in the budget right now. We can talk about those things. You all know what we're talking about as we start working on the budget. But those are some other things. My point is, we looked at this as if we don't do a lot of the new spending, what I'm calling again lean years, we're not in drastic cuts. This is not the sky is falling situation. This isn't some kind of a doom and gloom budget. It's a leaner budget. And 22 will probably also be a leaner budget because, and once, staff is talking about this a lot, but we don't have the numbers to show you. Once we can show you the payback schedule projections from the TIFs, you can see where that money starts to come in to refill the general fund reserve coffers fairly quickly in a couple of years. There's some other things that are going to happen in the community. Those buildings are being built. Some are occupied right now. There's people living in the houses next door. There's people living in some other places. Some of the Everton facilities have been sold. Even some horrible disastrous thing we can't foresee actually happening, and everything just stopped right now, all of that property has increased EAV. And the TIF revenues, it would be a lot less than we were anticipating, but will be coming in. There's no reason to believe all of that is going to stop. That will be increasing. Plus, there's development going on outside of the TIF, which we get property taxes from. I can't count how much those people will spend in town or won't spend in town, but there are things that will contribute to our increasing revenues over time, including increased headcount of population. Won't get counted in the census because they're not going to be occupied by April 1st. Some will. There's a lot more units occupied since 2010 in our town that have been built, and vacant houses have been sold and now occupied. But 2,000 new people eventually will be here. We'll count a few of them April 1st. The rest we can capture in a special census, but not until about 23, calendar year 2023, when the census starts allowing special census again. And then at about 24, we'll start getting the increased per capita revenues from them. There's a lot of things coming. That's when I say if we could do a budget based on a 3 or 5 year basis, we don't have a whole lot to talk about right now except to talk about an accounting change. Because we do it on a year-to-year basis, it looks a lot lumpier. There's fluctuations, peaks and valleys, if you will. That was a very long answer to your question, Alderman.
I guess my reaction is to it is because of the new growth and the new things that are coming. I don't know whether you always want to cut the new spending, because sometimes there could be some very valid things within those proposals that support the new growth, the new population, and the new things that are happening. That's why I think it's important personally, or a different philosophy might be to look at all the existing things, the personnel, the overtime budget, the other, maybe some of the funding that goes from hotel tax to different events, and evaluate those, because that's when you recognize certain efficiencies that you can create when you move forward by potentially looking at different position openings when they occur and seeing whether you can streamline your system or not. I know it's not a doom and gloom picture, but I just think that you have to look at the whole situation and not just segment and make arbitrary cuts on the new spending, because some of those might be very important for the growth of the city and the design of the community that we're creating.
Sure, and I would agree with you. I'm taking shortcuts with my answer. Well, believe it or not, those are shortcuts with my answers. But we'll talk about all those things as we're going forward at meetings, because I can answer that more fully when you have the information and we can show you what was removed from the budget. There still are some new things in the budget. I'll share one with you is we need another building inspector in the community development department. Why is that in? We removed a couple of other positions from consideration for this year. Put these things on delay, not removed them forever, by the way, because we have a lot of buildings to inspect in the next 2 years. And if we don't hire an inspector, we're going to have to, Ron mentioned this at his budget presentation too, we're going to have to use a consulting service, which will end up costing us more per inspection and probably overall, and we'll get less in the long term. And there's likely some attrition around the time that bubble ends of all the development, which will turn out nicely. But just an example of we're trying to do intelligent reductions. When I've talked to the staff, and again, we'll share this with the council, I called it, my terminology, discretionary new spending. If it was a grant, if it's a contractual obligation, if it's something that we're committed to, or if we have to do because there's a mandate of a federal or state rule, it wasn't discretionary. Even things that are like the Mac Road grant projects, we're moving along with grants and we have agreements with the Forest Preserve and the township. Trying to cut that out with the design money this year would make no sense to me. Now, ultimately, that's a council decision, but those kind of things are spending that's still in there that we're ongoing. But if we were looking at a whole new, adding a person, we're talking about in a couple of different ones. Again, we'll talk about these in the budget meetings with more detail. It probably isn't the time to do that. Ultimately, it's going to be a council decision. We'll walk through all these things with you. If you wish to transfer revenue around that way, we certainly can. There's other sources that we can probably tap for some smaller things, or there's always options for increases. But we're looking at this without increasing any revenue, using existing revenues and getting through a couple of leaner years to where we can get back to all the things that you wish to do.
And let me also just cut in response to your very correct assessment, Alderman Widener, that the City Council needs to weigh its priorities as to which new programs might be worth funding, even at the expense of existing programs.
Sure.
Which is why we have the city work plan on the agenda, and we'll get to that later tonight, and we'll be able to talk about it again at the next meeting after we have our budget document to look at, so that we can look at all the costs and benefits and weigh them against one another equally instead of speculatively right now when we don't have most of those numbers in front of us.
Okay, I just want to make sure all perspectives are looked at, and including new revenues. I think it's a fine time to look at potential for new revenues too, so I would be interested to see thoughts on potential new revenue sources too to look at.
Okay. We have not specifically looked at new revenues beyond what might come from existing taxes or fees from existing or from buildings under construction or proposed things like, for example, we know we're going to get some new revenue when a Culver's opens from food and beverage, sales tax, et cetera. We haven't looked at any potential new taxes or fees. If that's something that the council wishes us to do, we can take a look at that. We have not done that to date. We've looked at it in the existing revenues and with our projected expenses and just tamping, I call it tamping down on new expenses and delaying them for a couple of years so we can get to the point where we are in a better cash position. But we can do that.
It seems, I know that permits and fees, don't accumulate a huge amount of money, but I just think it's important, the same way a business like Disney would look at their fee and admission charges every few years, that we make sure that we're updating those every 5 to 7 years or whatever the best management practices are as we go.
Right now, what I'll commit to, because just to get anything for the next meeting on Monday, we have to get it done by Wednesday. We'll commit to putting that on the agenda for more discussion on the regular budget items, and we can get more feedback. I know you're all getting this just tonight, all new, and there's a lot, as Alderman Goodman said, a lot of information to digest, and this isn't the end of this discussion. So we can add that as an item on the regular agenda, excuse me, under the budget for discussions on March 2nd and go from there. You'll have the budget books to give you a little more time to think about it too.
Next was Alderman Davalos.
Yeah, I have a couple questions, I guess for Kevin. So just give me a little detail on how the accounting change, or why it happened. Was it our accountants? Was it the ERP? Was it?
It was a combination of our accountants looking at TIFs and, so all the TIFs they deal with in their business, and knowing that there's scrutiny on TIFs statewide, they as a firm made a decision that they wanted to help municipalities paint a clearer picture of how TIFs impact the individual communities, and to better designate such things as our loans, to show them as more of a long-term liability than short-term. The way they showed it was not wrong. the way we show it now, beginning in 2019, was just better.
Okay, because to me, maybe it cleared up some of the issues I had the last budget issues, or the last budget cycle. With all of these non-spendable, restricted, assigned, committed, unassigned, I struggled with that last year to understand. So just to help me a little, again, you're saying that the non-spendable category are the old special projects fund?
No.
Okay.
Non-spendable is basically the interfund loans to the TIFs.
To the TIFs, okay.
And there's a very small part that happens every year, which is prepaid expenditures, which I won't get into. It's just things like we pay for in April what's not due until June. So it's those things you do at the end of every audit anyway. So non-spendable
Okay.
is largely the interfund loans.
Okay, and that was estimated like 5 million between TIF 3 and 4.
By the end of 2021, it's estimated that'll be just about $5 million.
Right, and so we knew that. I mean, to me, this isn't a giant surprise. I kind of like it that it's cleared up because it's actually clear to me. And now I kind of know where the debits are and where the assets are. And I know a budget is different than an accounting form. You've always
Right.
said that.
Can I interject one thing?
Sure.
Yes. Kevin's our accounting person, and we have auditors and all that, so I'm trying to always translate into management terms what we're talking about. The interfund loans are IOUs due to the general fund from the TIFs. The money, the cash, in a real sense, was there. If we'd had emergency, it could have been spent. The difficulty, Kevin is probably going to bristle and correct me in my accounting terms. The difficulty would be if we had an emergency and had to start spending that money. And
Spending what money?
spending the contingent money that was the 25% fund balance that we had reserves. And at the same time, something happened where the TIFs, go back a couple of years, had never developed at all. Musselman, the Earhart
Right,
buildings aren't
right.
there, Everton, all that isn't happening. We could get to a point where you have to show how we dealt with those loans, but we've already spent the money. That's why this accounting change is essential and necessary, because it now shows very clearly that money shouldn't be spent. It exists, but not in cash, so we shouldn't be spending it because we'd be spending it twice. The accounting change is a very good move, but it makes a big fluctuation in fund balances that,
Oh, I think it's a great move, because when I was talking to everybody last year, in my understanding of this, it was sort of like sometimes the loans to the TIF, they would be repaid, so they're sort of not a debit, but an asset. I mean, I'm not gonna go into all these confusions and
Right,
things I've thought about for 12 months.
Yes.
But I'm glad that it's going to be more clarity and more transparent. I think
Yes.
that's good. The old special projects fund, the 2 million something, is that still not spent? Or, I mean, we're gonna add it back to the general fund as actual part of the reserves now?
Correct. So what we recommended, it's approximately almost $3 million
Right, right.
dollars that we can do with as we see fit, or, as this council guides us to do. We're recommending that we make that available in the unassigned fund balance so we can continue to move ahead and do the things we need to do going forward until those investments in the community start to be realized when we get money back out of the TIFs.
Okay, and so do we have an assigned fund? That used to be a term, an assigned fund balance. That's sort of
Well-
gone with the new accounting.
No, that's part of our recommendation to help shore up the unassigned fund balance. That 2.9 million, if you were to say
Right.
to us, we do not want to designate that money, the 2.9 would stay right in the general fund, would continue to be used as we've been using it, which is for these larger one-time, mostly public works related projects. So it would continue to stay in there and continue to be used that same way. It would still be available for that. In theory, it wouldn't be available for our regular, everyday expenses that we incur.
But it's part of our reserves, our new
Correct.
calculation of reserves.
Correct.
Okay, so that kind of clears up all those fun things. So to me, a lot of this is just, I mean, I think this could be really good for us in a way. A lot of this is just trying to incorporate the new way we're calculating things. And that's probably a really good thing, because I was really confused last year, so I think it's going to be better this year. A couple things, and this is just it's only 20,000, but I'm not sure, we can't figure some of this out in-house. I know you'd like to project, everybody would like to project the revenues, but I think you only come close. And maybe you get a feel for it, but it doesn't mean that's what it's going to be. And so I may be looking at this in a simplistic way, but I guess I'm kind of over with consultants for a while. But I would go along with them with what the majority of the council said. I'm just not sure. I mean, even 20,000 seems important. But so the new numbers you're talking about here is we're back up close to our reserve goal.
Yes, by releasing
Yes.
that assigned fund, by releasing that money
Right.
that's now
And the other things
earmarked,
you're suggesting.
it would bring us
Yeah,
back up
that's
to
what
our
I'm
reserves.
calculating here.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Alderman Christian.
Thanks. Yeah, real quick, the one page we didn't talk about here was this examples of general fund balance uses. And there's no column headings on this, so I'm assuming that this middle column is where the money went to?
Correct. I'm sorry, it didn't print accurately, and I was changing things as I went, adding things up. That's the middle column is the column where that expenditure was incurred. The column to the right is the amount of the expenditures.
So from general fund to whatever that middle column is?
Well, no, so like that first one there, the Johnson and Wangren properties were accounted for in TIF number 3.
Okay, so it's not, okay, but it's, and then
And
it's,
which then ultimately were covered by loans from the general fund because there's no money in either of the TIFs.
so I'm assuming then at some point that number on the right column would be paid back, right? That's
Absolutely.
outstanding loans,
Absolutely.
other than the ones that are general fund, right? We don't get paid back
Correct.
for those, okay. One more question, can you, as far as the status or classification of a property, as it becomes, the EAV gets reassessed, can you walk through that timeline kind of, when does it change? Is it when it closes? Is that when the property closes on the ownership?
Well, while Ron's getting that, the property status officially changes once somebody closes on it. It changes whether, the two properties I was referring to, the Lexington Trace parcels and the Everton parcels, by and large, the majority of them, not every one, there's multiple pieces there, were agricultural assessments. Once they're closed, they now become commercial because they're now commercial or residential, which is a higher assessed level under the tax laws. The process and how those actually get officially recorded and documented, I think Ron is going to go through, but it has to do with the assessor's schedule. Whatever is occupied, and generally when a city or a county issues an occupancy permit, the assessor looks at that as a date that, to put in their books. Most of the time, it's not a perfect science in any way. If it gets done before September or in early September, it's going to get in there next year's or in the end of the year. October is about when the townships close their assessments for the year and record it. So anything that is at that level by the end of this summer will get recorded by the Winfield Township Assessor by October. That all goes through, then we go through all of our taxing bodies, go through their processes to set their levies, and the tax rates get milled. And the next summer, when they start, after they've collected the taxes, they'll start remitting them in June and September. So that's when we get the increase. But it's about a 1.5-year cycle from the start of construction till they get a point where it's increased it's either occupied or the assessed value of the property gets recorded, and then the levies get applied, and then it gets paid out to us. Ron can talk more about the schedule with the construction and those things.
I think you pretty much answered the question, unless there's something that he didn't cover. I mean,
Nope, that's good, thanks.
All right,
Thank
that's
you.
a rare one. Sometimes.
All right, Mayor, go ahead.
Just a clarification that there was a bump in the EAV when it went from agricultural to commercial. Now,
Yes.
there's going to be another bump as each of those units is actually occupied because the value goes up once they're occupied? Is that how that works?
Yes, that's correct, but it's of course in groupings, so maybe 50 townhomes will all be occupied by October and they'll all get in the books at the same time, but that's correct.
Right, so there's an incremental jump when it changes classification.
Correct.
But then when that classification starts to get built out, we get more and more jumps until it's completely built out.
Correct.
Okay.
Best illustrative example is the Two Brothers property. Nothing has been built there. Visually, you drive by there for decades now, nothing has changed there in a long, long time. But the moment Two Brothers closed on it with the next assessment cycle, the TIF increment in TIF 4 went up to about $50,000 a year it increased about $50,000 a year, mostly from that transaction because it went from being open space or some kind of other certificates, which are also a low tax assessment, to commercial ownership, and it increased automatically. Now, should they ever build there, it will increase even faster, but just the ownership change, catching up with the market value and the type of zoning and the way it's assessed, does change that value right off.
Right, thank you.
Okay. Just to go back over a couple of points that we've touched on, but maybe not gotten into. Would you say, in any concrete sense, that the list of tasks in the Special Projects Fund, that these expenses, the projects that were assigned by the accounting phrase, those tasks have in large part been accomplished, and that fund balance, other than the bucket marked assigned, was spent on those things? I mean, I'm not just talking about this list explicitly, because obviously these are mostly TIF-eligible expenses, and they wouldn't have been on the list of things. Before we combined the general fund and the Special Projects Fund, there was a list. It included things like the Deal Road turn lanes. I mean, there was a lot of different particular things we had in mind for that assigned balance, and many of those things have been completed. So when you look at this credited amounts that have gone down from 4.1 to 2.9 million, that's a relatively small piece of the total Special Projects Fund balance, but could we have credited more if we'd chosen to do so?
I will be providing you a list of what went against that or what was put against that. And the answer to your question is, yeah, we probably could have. I tend to be conservative in what I was trying to apply against that, maybe too conservative. But that was kind of the marching orders I had, was to find those things that were considered the one-time things we did before when we had special projects, and put those same kinds of things against that balance. That's what I've done so far. And again, I'll provide you a list, and we can decide maybe there were more things that could have gone there.
Certainly. I mean, that amount being 2 million that's left and this number being 8 million, I know that these are mostly TIF-eligible expenses, but there's some quite large general fund expenses that were taken out, and I don't see any of these numbers, which are special one-time uses. Everything on this list is essentially fits that description, but we could have described it that way, and we could have credited it against this $2.9 million number, unless I'm misunderstanding things?
No, we could have, and that's something we'll be able to work through as we go through the budget. We can decide there might be more that could go into there. But if we're making the recommendation to roll that into the unassigned, how much more we charge, and it really won't make too much of a difference, because
Yes.
it all ends up in the same place at that point. But we could certainly go through that list, and I could show you what we've put against that assigned fund balance.
Yes, just to see if this is really a very large bucket or not. I mean, there may not be as much left in this bucket as we thought. And I think one way of thinking about that, at least what I have been thinking as I've been considering this issue for the last couple of weeks, is that in the Special Projects Fund, we knew there was going to be a lot of volatility. We knew that there were going to be years when we had a big influx of money that I think mostly came from the TIF 1 developer, and there were going to be years when we were going to be spending down a lot of it, and other years when it might be flat because there wouldn't be very much going on. And so having combined it into the general fund, we now need to be prepared to to see some of that volatility in the general fund instead.
That's correct.
Can I add to that? Part of the reasoning for rolling the special projects fund into the general fund at the time was the special projects fund really had no source of income. There wasn't anything that fed that fund. So it was just kind of a pile of money sitting off in a corner doing special projects with no way to refill that bucket at all. It made no sense at the time to hold that special fund over on the side. So that's part of why we rolled that into there, so that there would be a way to keep track of it, and to have it in one place, and those special things still could get done with that money.
And at this point, there's no particular reason to go backward and say, well, we could have credited this expense from 2 years ago against that number, and then this line of the non-spendable fund balance would look differently in past years. There's no point in doing that, especially if we do the staff recommendation right now and just move the whole bucket over into the unassigned fund balance.
Correct. It wouldn't make much sense to go back at this point, because you'd be moving it from one pocket into the other. That's all you'd be doing.
But it's helpful to think about it that way, to think that we could have made these credits in a somewhat more graduated way, so that it isn't really as sharp of a difference as it looks like, unless I'm misunderstanding what's going on here. And I think you've agreed with me, so I think that I am. All right, so to touch on the fund balance work group, one thing that's been discussed in terms of the fund balance work group going forward, and I do agree with staff that we should meet more regularly in the future, because if anything, I felt like the fund balance work group achieved a couple of things. Kevin described it at the time as low-hanging fruit, and then we were delayed. And I understand staff's preoccupation because of the ERP, and I understand that it would have been useful, especially given the shock of this situation, if we'd been having those meetings perhaps on a more regular basis and thinking about fund balance holistically with senior staff. But one question that was asked when I was discussing the current situation with a certain former alderman and former chair of the Finance Committee, who wanted to know why we don't really have a policy rationale for what the fund balance in the hotel motel fund should be, and if that's something that should be considered by the fund balance work group. Because the fund balance that's in that fund right now is far and away above anything that was in that fund at the time of this other person that I'm talking about serving on the city council. So the question of why we're keeping so much money in there seemed like a real obvious solution to him to the entire problem. And there might be policy reasons that the council wants to think about that, but I think that should certainly be added to our task list as a fund balance work group.
It should. There actually is a footnote. We won't get into it now. There is a direction from the council from the past. I think it's written in our financial policies to keep 1 year's worth of the grant amount in the fund balance, but we far exceed that.
We far exceed that.
hotel
I
motel
mean,
taxes.
it's 5 times.
Yeah,
or
so there is a policy, but it may not be current and needs to be revised. That's one of the things, one of many things I agree. I think we should look at with that work group. We don't need a whole lot of outside input for that. The council members that are part of that group and the staff can work through those and then bring recommendations back.
So is there a policy rationale for maintaining separation of the hotel motel fund from the general fund at this point? Maybe that's something else we should be thinking about.
Okay.
Because our restriction on using those funds has gone.
Correct, as a home rule
So
unit.
when that fund was created, there were different factors at play. It was a different situation, and maybe that is another thing to consider.
Okay.
All right. Next, slightly unpleasant subject, the LGDF. We have seen the governor's recent budget address. We can look ahead and see that if the referendum about the graduated income tax doesn't pass in November, then the governor's budget would begin to take more of our LGDF funds. When we sat down on the 2nd and we were looking at the tax revenue amounts, just comparing it to the numbers that are here in front of us today, that tax revenue is actually the projections are higher. It's only about 120,000, and in 2021, an extra 150,000. But given that the only thing I know of that's substantially changed since February 2nd is the budget addressed by the governor, and that's the only factor that I'm aware of that might affect our future revenue. I was surprised to see that number go up, and I know that staff has told me that they're going to have some future update for us on that.
I don't remember that part of it. I know we're going to be talking about all those revenues. Kevin and I just today have, and by the way, Alderman, thank you for pointing out that the IML executive director had emailed out the changes from the governor's address. It was last week as we're all getting ready for the mayor's State of the City address. We got an email from IML that said, oh, here's what the governor said, and it was paragraph after paragraph of a very shortened abstract of what the governor spoke about. And sort of buried in there was, oh, by the way, the LGDF will not be returned to the 100% that was alluded to recently, but instead they're going to continue the 95% level that has been the last couple of years. And by the way, they're going to reduce starting July 1st, another 5% just to hold that money back in case the income tax amendment to the state constitution doesn't pass. So they'd have some more reserve money. So from that, we have to assume, it's the governor's proposal. It hasn't been voted on or considered yet by the General Assembly, but given the majorities, I'm assuming that's going to pass by and large, and it's a fairly easy vote in the past for the legislature to make. So we have gone back today, and Kevin has revised those numbers. If the budget had been issued 2 weeks ago, you would have said some very nice comments from me about how the state is working towards not taking our revenues and fixing their fiscal problems, and they're still working on their fiscal problems, which are long and deep, and it's going to take a while. But they're looking at city revenues again. City revenues, this is money we pay, by the way, if I may, for a moment. All of us pay income taxes every year to the state. You all know that. We're going to be paying them again in a few weeks. 10% of that, historically, income tax for the state has come back to local governments. 90% stays with the state. Now, I will argue for anybody that we need to have the state government, but as I've mentioned many times to many people, where do you see the most impact from that money? Do you see a snowplow and a police officer more often, or do you see, anyway, I'm editorializing now. So we will have a reduction in our, continuing reduction in the amount of money shared from the state. Kevin, the amount that you're projecting of the additional 5% is?
So over a 12-month period, my estimate is we'd lose a little over $72,000. The effect on the 2021 budget, since it wouldn't start that reduction until July, would be 10/12 of that, or about $60,000, has been factored into the 2021 budget as money that we would not be receiving.
And that
Okay,
has
and that's
now-
the conservative estimate if the graduated income tax plan does not pass in the
Correct.
referendum. But if it does, then the situation will be different, and we can reassess at that time. But until then, we certainly don't want to count on getting revenue that we may not get.
Right.
Absolutely.
And we have made that change. What I was saying 2 weeks ago, the budget would have looked differently that we're proposing. The change has been made to the numbers for the revenue to adjust that downward, that additional 5%. And it's also been changed in other parts of the budget to reflect the fact that they'll be taking that. So we've already made that correction, so you'll see that in the budget book when you get it.
Oh, okay, so so there won't be an update later. It is actually going to be in the budget book that we get on Friday.
Yes, there may be an update because we still don't know what the state may do, but
Sure.
as far as that fact, yes, we have been able to figure out that total amount. We've gotten better projections since we last spoke. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. In the memo that was in our backup material, you referenced the effect of the census and talked about how you would expect per capita revenues to increase. I found the phrasing of that confusing. Can you clarify that? Because I don't think you mean that the amount per capita will increase. I think perhaps you mean that the total amount will increase just because there'll be a higher capita, more people.
Makes sense.
But just wanted to clarify that.
One moment, I got to get a copy of it. I left it up.
It's page 2 of 2 of your memo. It says, "The new Census 2020 count is also expected to increase per capita revenue."
Correct. Because the resulting count from the 2020 census if I understood your question right, will include all the houses that have been built from 2010 to and occupied by April 1st, 2020. So those
Right,
will
but
get counted.
increases of per capita revenue makes it sound like per capita,
Yes.
the revenue will increase. And I think that's the opposite of what you're actually saying, right?
Okay, maybe it's not worded correctly. We will get more money on a per cap, we'll have more people, so we'll be getting more money,
Okay,
but the
All
amount of money per person won't change. Well, the state changes it all the time, but assuming all things are equal and it's 100, for hypothetically $100 a person, we had 300 people between 2010 and the new census that are here, we'll get 100 times 300 every year going forward till the next census.
all right, because I really couldn't figure out how the census would change the per capita
Okay,
revenue.
no, that would, thank you, it's semantics here.
We'll get more money because we have more people.
That's
yes.
right.
But the state would set that amount that they're gonna share, but we'll have more people and get a bigger share.
I just wanted to be sure I was understanding what you were saying.
Okay.
All
Try to
right.
reword that.
Lastly, the police pension funding questions that Alderman Widener had. The police pension funding has been somewhat variable. If I remember correctly, I recall a year in which we made extra payments, but due to actuarial changes, our percentage funding actually dropped. And that was a pretty recent year. And it was very strange at the time. We talked about, well, they're accounting for some different things. So looking forward, it's very hard to say what will happen with that 73% number.
It is impossible to know right now what's going to happen with that at all.
Yes,
There are
and
just
that's,
far too many factors involved, like you say. Even though we put additional money in, outside things can influence what the actual returns are, that then ultimately can have an effect on what actuarially is determined as our contribution. You get changes in the population of the officers involved in that. I mean, there's just so many things that move that I can't tell you what it would be going forward. There's really no way to do that.
okay. And lastly, I want to address something which again may seem like semantics, but when you've announced this to us a few times, and in some of the discussions, you've used the word deficit. But the numbers that we're showing today don't show a deficit. It's 6% reserves. So that's not exactly a deficit. It's low, but it's not the -7. It's not a panic situation. It's a serious situation,
Yes.
but it's not a, we need to run for cover right now kind of panic.
Absolutely correct, absolutely correct.
So-
As I
so in
said, the
what
sky is
sense-
not falling. This isn't doom and gloom. This is something we need to pay attention to and be careful with our spending.
Exactly, but
do
I
we-
know the word deficit has been used, and people have
Yes.
asked me, what exactly do you mean by that? And is it still a deficit after this 6% number has been reached, and it's not -7 anymore?
I would agree with that. The deficit comes into play, as I was saying, it's been about 2.5 weeks now when we finally got the final revenue projections in to match up with the expenditures. At that point, there was a lot more things in the projected budget, not approved, in terms of decision packages and new spending that would have caused a deficit situation. So that's where I'm referring to. That
Okay,
I have just directed to take all those, set them aside, not show them in the projected budget, because I will not be recommending them. Now, you all make the final decisions on all of these things, but I can't see that the council would want to go into that situation. But that's where it started, is reviewing those things, making some initial reductions to what we're projecting in the future. This is, you're correct, this is all workable. It's just optically, it looks very odd, and it needs to be explained. And I'll summarize in a minute, but you're correct.
okay.
We're not
So-
looking at that anymore.
Because I know that that's a word that can scare people, especially when it isn't clear what we're meaning when we say it.
Right. And that's part of why we're here, to explain all of this.
Okay, good. Are there further questions on item 1?
If
Go
I could
ahead
just make
and wrap up,
A couple of
yes.
things. Some things came up, and I know Leo and Kevin are feverishly writing down notes, so we will be bringing back more information in the coming weeks. The one message I do want to leave you with, and thank you, Alderman, for pointing out, this isn't dire. This is actually, in large part, the result of many, what I believe are positive investments that you have made in the community, in the TIFs, and sometimes not in a TIF, like the Deal Road improvements. It's not a TIF anymore, but that helped our current businesses. It allows easier access for Target and restaurants and all those places down there. So there's good things that are starting to pay off. and they're going to pay off more and more, but it takes time. And there's a reason government is slow, but it is slow. And we will get those payments. 2 years ago, I could not have stood here and told you for certainty that we would be getting money back because the developments had not started yet, but they have now. So we are in a good long-term position. We're going to have a couple of lean years to deal with so that we don't overspend and make a situation that is a problem out of something that is just something that we have to manage well. In terms of the consultant, I hear all your comments. My concern is we have been doing things the same way for a long time, and it's worked good enough. It's worked pretty well, but we could do better. But given the current workload that Kevin has, that I have, we're not going to be able to go out and find new modeling for revenues and expenditures. Those things take some time to assess. Bringing in some additional eyes sooner than later can help us to make some changes going forward. We can discuss this on and on. But I use past, this will sound worse than I mean it. Going forward, if we don't make any changes to it, we're not going to improve those projections. And I think we can be more precise and make them a lot better, and probably even make some adjustments to the budget so things are clearer and easier to understand in the future. But with what we're facing in terms of internal things, year after year, we will be coming back at the same point next year with the same modeling that we currently use, which is not real precise. It's not very sophisticated. So that is why I've looked at moving ahead with that. And it's not a lot of money to invest. We do bring in some low-cost consultants or get advice on a regular basis, or we go to training or programs that can cost a few $1,000s. I think this will be a good investment and pay off well. We can continue to talk about that. And, boy, I made a note now. I can't read what it says. A reminder, though, that the budget booklets are coming out. If there's any questions, even before the next meeting, that any of you individually have, Kevin and I are always available, probably sometimes too much because you have our cell phone numbers too. But if you're lying awake and want to talk about it, we're probably awake at 2 in the morning anyway. But anytime during business hours or any other time you want to email or call or leave us a question on a voicemail or an email, we'll get back to you as soon as we can. We'll share those questions with everybody and the answers to them. I really look at this as just, the meeting again tonight was to give you this part of it, to give you a heads up about what's coming, so you didn't just get that and then wonder. As our normal process, we wouldn't talk about the details until the Saturday morning meeting, and that's weeks from now. You should know about that because you may hear about it. This is all going to be public information. And the other is there's a lot of meetings to work these things through and make sure everybody's comfortable with all the information we presented. So we'll leave it at that for now and move on to the next item. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, the second item on the agenda is the citywide work plan. And I know there have been some comments that related to that already. And I know that staff has made some changes. So I guess my first question is, have there been any further changes to this citywide work plan since the last time we saw it? And does the council have any more discussion about what some of those changes are? Let's start with Alderman Krischel.
Yeah, it might have been on the last revision of this, but I think I was looking at number 18 in Tier 1 initiatives regarding the expansion of solar-powered radar speed monitoring signs. And my comment is that I'm not sure that belongs on Tier 1 initiatives. I think it's important, but as far as the other things on here that are notable, like obviously negotiating employee contracts is pretty important, ERP implementation, inventory of all EMRP fixed assets, those seem to be Tier 1. 18, I'd like to see moved down to Tier 2 at least.
Chief, do you have any comment about that?
Part of the reason that there was a Tier 1 was really twofold. Number one is because of the number of complaints we get regarding speeding, and the speeding, for the most part, the complaints that we get is in residential areas. The other was there was an envelope for grant funding availability with this, so that was the other reason it was a Tier 1. We had a certain opportunity to apply for a grant.
Right, so just as a reminder, the definition of Tier 1 is the highest priority initiatives, things that are time-sensitive and cannot be delayed without costly and/or significant negative long-term impacts. So, it's not clear that there would necessarily be costly or significant long-term impacts, but not being able to get a grant is a costly impact.
It's not a tremendous amount of money. I think altogether here we're talking somewhere in the area of $700 to $800, but it's $700 or $800 if we get a grant for. It doesn't come out of the city's funds.
Okay?
So would that be the entire cost of the project, or all the signs we were gonna put up, or is that just the grant money available?
That would be the cost of the signs that we would purchase, and then there would be, I'd have to coordinate with Public Works Director to do the installation of these.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, other questions? I know there was some discussion about new projects that had been deleted that we might want to consider. If there's more commentary on that, this is a good time. Maybe not. Okay, well, after we have the budget, maybe it'll be a better time to look through this again. I don't want to keep everybody here. That is the last item on the agenda. Alderman Weidner.
If there's no other comments or questions, I move we adjourn.
Motion by Alderman Weidner, second by Alderman Ashour. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.